Hi, what's up, social media world, Facebook and YouTube? So, thank you guys for joining me tonight for our off-road essentials. We are going to be talking about traction, specifically traction control devices, whether they be, lockers, traction control, traction boards, right? But different traction devices. So, hey, Kevin. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we get into that, so what have we been up to? Well, last weekend we were in Nashville at Bell's Reserve there working for the weekend. Bell's Reserve had a bring your own vehicle booking with a Rivian in the pouring down rain. And the property, of course, was soaked and muddy because of the snow that they had there. But the Rivian did great. We had a great time. It was actually the SUV version and the quad motor version, which was really unique and actually ties directly into what we're going to be talking about today with traction, right? Because the electric vehicles, their whole traction thing works very differently. So that's where we were. I got to see a really cool another event they had going on. We had a trail ride with about 5 or 6 vehicles there. A couple of forerunners. The Rivian joined in on that. We had a '74 Ford Bronco. That was really cool. And had a Tacoma, I believe. And then they had a dinner, a really high-end fire cooked dinner, cooked over a fire by Rambler Events, which was really neat to kind of see that. And, they had this really cool outdoor setting in this huge, like circus tent almost that was heated. That was pretty neat. But the food was amazing. I got some leftovers after they were done, and it was pretty neat to eat the food, and they cooked it again right over the fire. The veggies, everything's cooked right over a fire. So that was pretty neat to see that and be a part of that. And always enjoy spending time there at Bell's Reserve. This upcoming weekend, we are leaving Friday for Windrock. We're taking a Commonwealth 4x4 out on an intermediate trail ride at Windrock. We're super excited about that. To get those guys out on the trail with some of their customers and some of their new built rigs. Really looking forward to that. So outside of that, quick introduction. I know I had a few messages of some new faces jumping in, right, and asking a little bit more information about us. So my name's Mike Morrison. I'm a certified International Four-Wheel Drive Trainers Association trainer for about 10, 11 years now. And I've been doing training for about 12 years with military, recreational, and commercial groups, all in off-road driving and recovery, field expedient repair, all that kind of cool stuff. My wonderful wife, she partners with me, and we run Morrison's Outdoor Adventures, providing training mostly to the recreational crowd, and we do trips as well. So if you're interested in any of that, feel free to jump on. I'm going to throw a QR code up there. Scan that QR code or go to morrisonsoutdooradventures.com. And you can see our list of classes and our upcoming dates and everything there of what we have to offer if you want to be a part of that. And even we try to keep everybody up to date with the events and stuff that we go to. So let's talk about traction, right? There's a lot of things that go into traction. We already did a live stream on tires. If you're interested in seeing that, you can go over to our YouTube channel and check that out. We do keep all of our live streams over on the YouTube channel, and we talked all about tires, tire construction, air pressures, all that kind of cool stuff. But so outside of tires, there's other things that kind of go into traction, right? When we think about how the power is being applied down to the ground, there's one piece of our normal combustion engine style vehicles that plays a huge role in how that power is applied down, and that's differentials, right? Again, we're not talking about electric vehicles yet. We're talking strictly about differentials, okay? Your vehicles, all vehicles that we drive, typically have 2 differentials, sometimes 3, but we're going to focus on just the 2. There's a differential on the front axle between the front 2 front wheels, and there's a differential on the rear axle between the rear 2 wheels. Okay, so I'm going to throw up, let me see here. All right. So this is just a very basic of the internals of a differential, right? Super basic. But inside your differential, and again, there's one on the front, one on the rear, but your drive shaft comes into what we call a pinion gear. Okay, you see the pinion gear labeled there. That pinion gear, as the power flows through the transmission and transfer case, the pinion gear on the front and the rear of the vehicle spin. Okay, and if we are in true four-wheel drive, whether it's four high or four low, okay, but true four-wheel drive, those pinion gears spin equally. Okay, they never differentiate because it's a hard connection between the two. So they're never differentiating power in any way. And as those pinion gears spin inside those differentials, they spin that ring gear. Okay, and for you Land Rover drivers, right, crown gear is what some of it calls it because it kind of looks like a crown. But that ring gear, okay, is spun by that pinion. Again, there's no differential here. There's no change in the power being applied. The front and rear is getting equal power. But that ring gear is connected to a carrier, okay? And inside of that carrier, in a standard open differential, right? An open differential houses what we call spider gears and side gears. Okay, if we look to where that circle is right there, on the side, those are what we call side gears. That is what is actually physically mounted to splines on your axle shafts. Okay, whether you have CV axles or a solid axle, those side gears have splines in them, and they are what the axle shafts actually go through and turn. Okay, the top and bottom have spider gears, right? Or some people call them differential gears. I like to call them spider gears. But this is where we can get that different power transfer. Okay, so each differential in the front and the rear has this setup in an open differential setup. Okay, and when one tire on that axle has more resistance than another tire, then the path of power always goes sort of the path of least resistance. Okay, and I'm kind of simplifying this as much as I can, but think about it like water, right? Once this ring gear is spinning and the power goes through these spider gears and side gears, if let's say the driver's side of our vehicle is on pavement and the passenger side of our vehicle is in mud, the power is going to the driver's side, right? There's still some power going to the passenger side, but the power is going to the passenger side in the mud. The power on the driver's side is insufficient to move the vehicle, right? Because it's just not getting enough torque. More torque or the power is being spun in the mud on the other side, right? Could be tires in the air, could be, just differences in traction. And it doesn't even have to be one side or the other. It could be diagonal tires. We call that a cross axle spin out, right? So it all happens inside those spiders and side gears. And you can see there, the axle shaft to the wheels. Okay. I tell people don't get too wrapped up in how everything happens in the differential. Just understand what its main job is, and that's to differentiate power left to right. Okay, differentiate power left to right. That's the main focus of the differential. And the reason for this is because when we are driving on the road, okay, and we turn the vehicle, or we're in a parking lot and we turn into a parking space, okay, all four tires are following a different path, right? So they have to be able to turn at different rates of speed. Obviously, the inside tires are taking a tighter route than the outside tires, okay? If you've ever watched track and field, right, and you see the runners start at staggers because the inside runner has less distance to travel than the outside runner. Same thing for your tires. If we were to go in a parking lot and drive through paint turned all the way, then look at it from above as we do a complete circle, there would be four different circles, almost like a bullseye. So those tires have to turn at different rates of speed in order to travel different distance. Okay, so that's what the differential does. If it didn't, then it would just drag a tire or chirp tires, and we'd wear tires and stuff out all the time. Okay, and our Forerunner that we have has a welded rear. So when I turn, that inside turn tire is just digging all the time. If I'm on pavement, one of those tires is chirping all the time. Okay, so just kind of understanding the focus of what the differential is. Again, differentiating power left to right. Okay. Now, there are things that can change inside of the differential that will make it function differently. Okay. We can have kind of older school limited slips, right? And these limited slips can be anything from clutch packs and springs to they can be electronic in newer age. They can even be worm gear like the Torsen, which is in the Ford Raptors and Humvees and stuff like that, the Torsen differentials. So they can be any type of different mechanism, but they're exactly as the name implies, they will limit the amount of slip that tires can have. But they're kind of an old school design to a certain extent in the fact that they will never take away 100% tire slip. Okay. Now, newer vehicles, okay, Toyota has 8-track, Jeep has brake lock differentials, okay, Ford has their traction control, Rivian's, they have traction control basically, electronic traction control. And it typically, when we're in 4-wheel drive, the way it functions is it does traction through braking, okay, and it can brake individual tires. We'll get into that more. Don't confuse this, okay? I'm going to change the picture here. Don't confuse this with the button here, okay? I call it the anti-fun button, but this is electronic stability control, okay? ESC, electronic stability control, or these lights on your dash, right? These are on-road traction control, not off-road traction control. And we'll touch on that a little bit more, but don't confuse the two, because most of our vehicles, when we go into 4 low, disables this on-road traction control, the electronic stability control. That does not disable our off-road traction control if we have it turned on. So it's two completely different things, and they function somewhat differently and somewhat the same, right? But they're designed for two different things. Very important to understand that, okay? But most modern vehicles have some form of traction control. And we can even, on some vehicles, adjust the aggressiveness of this traction control. Now, there's other things that we can do in our differentials, like this right here. We can install lockers, and there's all different variations of lockers. First off, we've got automatic lockers, then we've got selectable lockers. Automatic lockers are going to engage based on what they sense. We'll touch on that more. And selectable lockers, we can turn them on and turn them off, like your Rubicons or your a lot of your trucks now are coming with rear lockers, 4Runners, Tacomas. Your Broncos have front and rear lockers. So a lot of vehicles are getting lockers, okay? And they can be electric, they can be air actuated, they can be hydraulic actuated, they can even be cable lockers, right? But a selectable locker is much more common than your kind of standard automatic lockers are, right? But we can put a locker inside that differential and it will change the traction. So all these things have their pros and cons, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that one is better than the other, okay? Because again, they all have situations where they work better than the other. So let's go back, right? We'll go back a little bit. Let's talk about lockers first, right? Let's talk a little bit about lockers first. So in talking about, let's talk about automatic lockers, okay? Automatic lockers, because typically with selectable lockers, there's a little bit more of an install involved. You got to route wires, or you've got to route air lines. You got to have air compressors and all that cool stuff. But there's two types of automatic lockers. The first one I'm going to talk about, okay, here's an inside view of a differential, okay? See that carrier, that housing that the ring gear is bolted to, okay? That carrier right there that we see in the center, we no longer see those side or spider gears. What we see is a mechanism in there. This is what we call a lunchbox locker. Now, there's two schools of thought on why it's called a lunchbox locker. One is that it fits inside like a snack inside your lunchbox, inside that carrier. But where it actually comes from is lunchbox lockers were thought to be able to be installed on your lunch hour, right? Because they're very quick to install. Typically, you don't have to change anything with any of the serious stuff like pinion depth or back spacing or backlash or anything like that in your differential. You basically take the spider gears out and you put the locker in there. Okay, you put the lunchbox locker in there. Lunchbox lockers are typically very loud, right? Because they click a lot because they work off of springs. Most of them work off springs. Some of them have clutch packs, but they are an automatic locker. As one tire spins more than the other tire, then those springs ratchet down, transferring more power to the tire that has the most resistance or the traction. And eventually they can engage a true 50-50 split on that axle of the power. So let's say if we had a lunchbox locker in the front of our vehicle, right? Then that lunchbox locker would make it so that both front tires, regardless of type of terrain or the traction or resistance that they have, are going to turn at the same rate of speed, period, right? Period. But the downside to the lunchbox lockers, two downsides. One, we have to have some tire spin to get them to engage, and they may not engage right when we want them to, or they may engage when we don't want them to. Okay, because there are situations where lockers can hurt us more than they can help us. But that's a lunchbox locker. There is a little bit of difference in strength, right? Because you've got the carrier still in place. So there can be some strength issues there. And depending on the manufacturer of the lunchbox locker is not going to have as much strength as some of the other options out there. So double check our chat here. Oh, thanks, Tony. Hey, Randy. Hey, Norm. So that takes me to the next one, right? This is still an automatic locker, but this is a full carrier replacement automatic locker. One of the most common ones out there is a Detroit. This is actually a Detroit locker right here. Okay, it replaces the whole carrier and everything. And this is physically what the ring gear bolts to. So now we're taking away all of that strength issues, and we're replacing that entire carrier. Now, typically, again, this is a much more difficult install because you're having to change shims and stuff like that, and get your backlash, your back spacing, your pinion depth, and all that good stuff has to be reset when you're done, because you're physically taking that carrier out and replacing it. So it all has to be redone. So it's not necessarily something that you could do on your lunch hour, number one, but it's not something that someone without a little bit of knowledge about differentials can do. Now, these typically will engage faster, not always, depends on the brand, but will engage faster than a lunchbox locker. They're going to be a little bit quieter because there's no like clicking and stuff that goes on in there, but right, still kind of the same downsides in that they may not engage right when we want them to, and they may engage when we don't want them to. I always tell a story. I had a Land Rover that had a Detroit locker in the rear of it, a Land Rover Discovery 2. I know we all have our demons. But it had a Detroit in the rear, and that thing would engage and disengage on its own, right? I could be turning in a parking lot, and it would immediately engage and bind up and cause the truck to really start to not be happy on the road or in the parking lot. Also, there were times on the trail where I wanted some on side slopes and stuff like that where I didn't want both of those tires spinning at the same time, and they would start spinning at the same time because they would engage. So this is just another form of automatic locker, right? Now, I don't have a picture of a limited slip, but limited slips are kind of the same, right? In that typically, as our first one here, let me go back to this picture, but a limited slip is typically inside here of the carrier. Maybe I do have a picture. No, I don't. But they're inside that carrier, okay, just like our lunchbox lockers were. So they, again, work through whether it be clutch packs, right, kind of old school clutch packs and springs. Basically, as spins, those clutch packs would tighten down or heat up and tighten down, and the springs would tighten down. Or if you have like the worm gear, the more it spins, the more that worm gear kind of tightens down on it, sending that power to the tire that has traction, right? Taking that power, going the path least resistance and transferring it over to the side. But with a limited slip, they will not overcome 100% tire slip. They will not. Okay, you can have a tire in the air and a tire on the ground, and as that tire in the air spins, a limited slip won't do that. Where a locker, an automatic locker will, right? An automatic locker 100% will. So limited slips aren't as big as they used to be. It used to be, you know, when you go buy old TJs and YJs and stuff, you'd always look for the one with the sticker on it or one that had a limited slip in it, or we'd get limited slips for them. Okay. So, and put that limited slip in there because, again, it's kind of like a poor man's locker. We don't see it as much on vehicles, number one, because of the electronic trash control, but we're also getting factory lockers with them. So let's move on to what we call selectable lockers, right? And this is typically what, when people ask me, they're like, hey, what lockers do you recommend? I tell them, number one, we want a selectable locker. Okay, if we can afford it, then we want a selectable locker. The first one I've got pictured here, this is an air locker, an ARB air locker. So if you look at the carrier, completely replace that carrier. There's still spider gears in there. Okay, there's still spider gears, but you can't see them. But there's a mechanism now inside that carrier that will lock those spider gears in place and basically give it equal traction left to right on that axle. If you have it on both axles, all four tires are going to spin at the same speed end, right? So with ARB air lockers, you have to have an air line. That's what that copper tube you see running around the top right there is. And then we see the blue line running in. So you do have to drill the housing to install them, put airline fittings in, and you do have to have a compressor in order to engage them. And they're not without faults, right? Now, I say this, I run an ARB air locker in the front of our Land Cruiser. And any ARB air lockers I've ever run, or I've even run like the Yukon air lockers, the zip lockers, I've never had one fail that was installed correctly. Most of the time when they fail, it's user error, okay, as far as the install, because you got to have some knowledge to install this. It's not super simple. That being said, I've installed it. So if you do enough research, yes, you can do it on your own. If I can do it, anybody can do it, right? But that airline coming in, going through that, it engages that mechanism. It's not a ton of pressure, but the great thing about air lockers is you get instantaneous engagement, instantaneous disengagement, okay? It typically does not take much to get them engaged, right? And that's why you see a lot of air lockers are run on racing vehicles because of their strength and their quick disengagement and engagement. Now, personally, another reason why I love air lockers is if something breaks, right? Something inside the locker breaks, an airline breaks, whatever it may be, it automatically opens. Okay, so we go back to an open differential. Some people may not like that, but most of the vehicles that I use, I drive on the road. So if the locker breaks, I want them to default to open. Again, that's personal preference, but if you are like in a race buggy or something like that and it breaks, you may want it, or a true off-road buggy, dedicated off-road rig, you may want it to default and always be closed, right? Locked in place. So personal preference for me there. Hey, Joshua. Hey, hey, Darren, TNT Overlander. Thanks, buddy. Glad to do it. So just in understanding that, right, that there are some differences there. So air lockers typically default to open. Also with air lockers, a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to put an air compressor in. You should have an air compressor on your vehicle anyways, right? Just because you need to have a way to air your tires up and down. And it doesn't necessarily mean you got to run ARB's air compressor. You can run any air compressor that will push sufficient volume, which really isn't, again, that much for the differential to engage the air locker or Yukon's locker. You can get any air compressor. And again, it's not that much. We actually, back when I was doing a lot of military training, one of the trucks we trained on had an air locker. The air compressor failed, and we actually engaged the air locker with a blood pressure cuff. So again, it's not a lot of PSI to engage it. So that is your selectable locker and air locker. Let's go to the next one here. Nope, not that one. Let me find the right picture. Here we go. All right, so this is an E-locker, okay, an E-locker. Let me hide this down at the bottom. And this is a picture I got from East Coast Gear Supply, who is great at setting up gears and lockers and everything. They do so many of them that they know it, right, inside and out as far as gears are concerned. E-lockers, however, are a little bit different. The install is going to be a little bit, tiny bit easier than an air locker if you're installing them after the fact, or if you have a vehicle that came with factory lockers, it came with e-lockers. Broncos, Toyotas, even Jeeps, they are electronic lockers. Okay, could be Eaton, Harrop, or it could be their own design, whatever it may be. Same as ARB still has the spider gears on the inside, but it has a mechanism that engages, whether it's through magnets or a little actuator motor, whatever it may be, that locks it in place and you get that equal power left to right. So it's still a selectable locker. This is a little bit of opinion, right? A little bit of opinion, but there is some truth here. E-lockers are super finicky. Okay. Number one, when you go to engage them, right, they have to have differential action to engage. I'm going to take this picture down real fast so I can do a little demonstration, right? So think about my fingers right here as the splines between your axle shafts. Okay. And we're trying to lock that in place. If I try to push my fingers together like this right here, I can't do it. They just flatten out or they just stay straight. You have to have a little bit of differential action between the two tires on that axle so that those splines line up and they go into place. Okay. So you actually need to drive a little bit and do what I call the wiggle, right? Where you're kind of swerving back and forth with your vehicle to get those splines to line up. Okay. So when you push that button and that light starts blinking at you on this, what I want you to understand is that electric signal and that electric motor that's actuating this, it's only going to try for a certain amount of time to engage. Okay. It's not unlimited. It's going to try for a certain amount of time. If it doesn't get it to preserve the motor and everything from burning up, it will stop trying. Okay. So you have to actually hit the button again to turn it off and then turn it back on to try to get it to engage. So it's good to be driving and doing that wiggle back and forth to get those electronic lockers to engage. Same thing to disengage them, is you need to do that little bit of driving and wiggle to get the pressure relief so those splines can come back apart again, right? Or whatever that mechanism may be. But e-lockers are not going to be as fast to engage and disengage as a air locker. That's just fact of the matter, right? And over time, because of corrosion and different things with the connector, whatever it may be, those e-lockers may not work every time that we want them to work, right? So we just have to be aware of that. And if you have e-lockers, like my Land Cruiser has a e-locker in the rear, ARB in the front, but the rear e-locker, when I want it to engage, I wiggle that vehicle back and forth to get it to lock in, and I can feel it physically, right? I can feel it. So also with the e-lockers, it's something to be said about minimum of once a month, you are engaging that locker to keep everything lubricated and engaging correctly, right? And make sure that everything functions. Don't wait until you need it on the trail and try to engage it. Norman Cole, should we stop the vehicle before, ooh, neat, I can actually show this up there. Norman Cole, should we stop the vehicle before engaging any of the various lockers? No, you don't have to stop the vehicle before you engage lockers. You can engage those lockers on the fly. Now, I don't recommend when you are in a serious bind, right? And everything's really bound up, or you're really spinning those tires trying to engage it. But if you're rolling up to the obstacle or you're backing off the obstacle, go ahead and hit that locker button to get it to start working on engaging. Okay. So we don't have to be at a stop for the vehicle to engage. Now, that being said, read your owner's manual to double check, but I see very few e-lockers that will engage. And there are some specific brands, okay, not going to name any brands, but there are some brands out there, that vehicle manufacturers, that their lights go solid, but those lockers aren't engaged until you start moving a little bit. I've seen this happen, right? Randy Lynn, Rosa, don't use it, you lose it. That is right. Okay, same thing with your four-wheel drive. We should be engaging our four-wheel drive through high range and low range once a month. Keep it working the way it should, right? But now the other thing with e-lockers, okay, they do not most of the brands out there do not default to open when something happens, right? they have to have that electric pulse to get them to open back up. So if something breaks or something happens inside the locker, they may not go back to an open differential, right? They can get jammed. I remember the Rubicons when they first came out in the TJs, there were some problems with the lockers. Again, people not using them consistently. They'd use them, once in a blue moon when they needed them, and then they'd get jammed in and they would not disengage. And it was just a nightmare getting them to disengage. I even know some guys who they had specific little tools and they had a sight hole in the top of their differential that they could get those differentials to engage with. So just understanding that, again, electric differentials typically like to be worked a little bit, and we got to have that differential action for them to engage. I don't have a good picture of it, but because they're super rare, but cable lockers, aux locker is a big one. Aux locker is a big cable locker, but basically just like a brake cable or anything like that, you have a lever that you pull that engages that locking mechanism. They have some benefits, right? Number one, it's a mechanical deal, so you can pull on it and engage them. There's no worries about compressors or anything like that. And like aux lockers, they even have a manual override if something happens to the cable down at the locker. It's a little bolt that you can spin and lock it in place. But the cable, just like bike cables, they can stretch and have some other stuff going on. Tony Tipton, the small paint marks indicate torque to spec on the bolts, etc. Yes. So you see the paint marks on the bolts. If they torqued it correctly, right? If they torqued it correctly, that's what we typically on suspensions and stuff like that. We'll put a paint pin mark on it. That lets you know if that bolt ever backs off. Okay, because if that line becomes separated between the two, it lets you know that it backs off. But typically in the mechanic world, that's just something that we do to make sure that we know, number one, that bolt didn't move, but also that bolt was torqued to spec. And because especially in differentials, torque specs are so important. Excellent question, by the way. So when you're choosing a locker for your vehicle, right, just keep some of these things in mind when you're kind of thinking about that type of stuff. Norman Cole, should we get lights before lockers? I guess, right? If you like all the lights. But keep this stuff in mind, ladies and gentlemen, when you are working towards putting a locker in your vehicle, right? And sometimes a cheaper route, it's all we can do. But on the other side of that, sometimes going cheaper on stuff can cause some more headaches down the road. But most importantly, okay, I'm going to say this super important. Most importantly, make sure if you are getting a shop to put your locker in, that they know 100% what they're doing. This is so important. I've had some great experiences at shops watching them do this work, and it's always, one guy in the back who does a locker because he's done them, right? And again, East Coast Gear Supply does a ton. I watched the mechanic at Commonwealth, Adam, watched him do the locker install just recently and do gear and everything. Man, it just takes so long to get everything right. You have to really know what you're doing. So just being aware of that. Don't go to any shop and just think that they can put a locker in. And a good shop will warranty their work, right? Warranty the work. So another question, what about a spool? Ooh, a spool. Let me go back to a picture. All right. So what a spool does, okay, again, same thing right here, okay, two very common modifications people will make is either a spool or what we call a Lincoln locker, okay? But basically what a spool does, same thing, it does away with the spider and side gears right here, okay? It does away with them, and it is a piece that is a piece of steel that is splined, and it goes over both axles. It is always going to be engaged, right? There's no mechanism, no way to disengage it. A spool basically does away with the differential. So the differential can no longer differentiate power left to right. Okay, again, very common in drag cars, very common in dedicated off-road rigs, stuff like that. Lincoln lockers, however, right, like my Forerunner that I have, they basically weld these spider gears in place. Okay. They put weld tacks on these spider gears so that they cannot turn. Okay. And there's a whole lot of arguments back and forth, but it was a very cheap way to make sure that you got no differential action. Again, this was very common on vehicles that were dedicated off-road rigs. So a Lincoln locker, and that name came from Lincoln welders, right? So they'd weld it up and it'd be ready to go. But it's only the spider gears, right? Only the spider gears that they're welding. So excellent question, Zach. So yes, East Coast Gear Supply also certifies other shop mechanics to install their gears and lockers, etc. Yeah, they teach a school. They do a school where you can go learn about it. It ain't cheap, but the other thing about that is, and they even say this in their school, like you got to do some gears to know what you're doing, right? So, all right, now let's talk. And you guys feel free to post any more questions about differentials and stuff, but let's talk about electronic stability control, right? Which is that on-road traction control. And this is where we're going to talk about the difference between this and off-road traction control. So right here, you see the button, okay, this where it says off. Again, don't confuse this with your off-road traction control. This is electronic stability control. I think, if I remember right, 2007, the Vehicle Safety Commission mandated that in year 2007, all vehicles had to have electronic stability control. Okay, this is on-road traction control. This is not off-road traction control. These two lights that we see on our dash have nothing to do with off-road traction control. Okay, super important because it never fails in a class. I have somebody, they're like, well, I don't have traction control. My light's on when I'm in 4 low. No, it disables that because it functions a little differently than off-road. What electronic stability control does when we go into a turn on the road, whether it's in inclement weather or whatever, it still handles some braking, right? But it's not as aggressive on the tires, okay, when it senses a tire spinning or slipping, but it also cuts out your throttle, right? That's not necessarily something that we want off-road, cutting out our throttle. If we were halfway up a slick, muddy hill and suddenly it cuts our throttle out, that's not something that we want due to traction loss, okay? So just keep in mind, again, this is very different from our off-road traction control, all right? So not to confuse you too much, but again, electronic stability control, then the off-road traction controls can be A-Track for Toyota, brake lock differential, everybody has their name for it. But let's talk about off-road traction control and how it works, okay? Off-road traction control has the ability, at each tire, it has wheel speed sensors, okay? And inside of the hub, there's this little mechanism, looks almost like a gear with little cogs on it, right? That as it spins, that wheel speed sensor is counting, and it's comparing it to the other side of that axle, the other tire on that axle, to see which one is spinning more than the other. What it's trying to do is keep those tires turning at an equal speed or an equal rate, right? And if it senses that one of those tires is moving faster than the other, it will brake that individual tire, okay? It will brake that specific tire. And through applying brake pressure, it adds resistance that transfers back and transfers that power back to the tire that has good traction, right? Now, all that to be said, again, you don't have to understand necessarily how it's doing that process, but just understand that when those tires start spinning and we have traction control, we need to let those tires spin a little bit in order to get that traction control to work, right? And I'm going to say this, and this is not popular opinion, but this is my opinion. There are more times where I see that traction control helps us than I see a locker helps us, right? I see traction control works much better in a lot of scenarios than lockers help us because it's stopping that one wheel and spinning the wheel that has traction. So this other wheel, if it's on a slippery surface, can help hold us in place. Whereas if both are turning, we can slide off whatever we're on. Let's take, for example, if we're on a side slip, right? We're driving sideways. And as we're driving along, we engage our lockers. Now all 4 of those tires, or 2 tires on that axle, are going to spin at the same time. And if that side slope's slippery, it's going to slide us down sideways. Okay, if it's a rear locker, the vehicle will actually spin the rear down, or if it's the front locker, the front can go down, or the whole vehicle can slide sideways if we have both lockers engaged, right? Norman, when I press the button in the Tacoma, it allows me to fishtail in the snow. If I do not press it, it will not swerve. Correct, right? That's why I call it the anti-fun button. If you try to do donuts with that button on, it's not going to let you. And when I'm in our Ram, right, and I pull off from a stop sign, if I want to do a burnout, I push that button, and right away, Sarah pushes it back so I can't do a burnout. So, but that's what it does, right? Susie Elliott Clark, is that the button in my Rubicon? Yes, that's the button. Your Rubicon has electronic stability control button. Most vehicles do. And that button can turn off or turn on that electronic stability control, but it's automatically turned off in 4 low. Okay, again. So, yep, there's Sarah saying, yep, I sure do. She doesn't let me do burnouts anymore. So that being said, right, again, don't confuse electronic stability control with our off-road traction control. It's completely different, 2 different systems. Now, with the traction control, we have to let those tires spin so that the traction control can do its job. We have to keep a consistent throttle. Darren Card, but not all the way turned off in 4 low on a Jeep, correct? Well, so it turns off it depends on the year of your vehicle. There's still some throttle stuff with the newer Jeeps, but it does turn off the electronic stability control. That's part of a different process, right? It keeps the brake lock differential working, right? It keeps that working, okay? But it limits the throttle aspect of it a little bit. And Jeeps are hard because there's not a dedicated traction control button like Toyota's, an A-track button we turn on and off. Jeeps, some years, for a long time, they didn't let you turn off their brake lock differential. There's no way to turn it off. The newer ones, okay, take the last 3, 4, maybe 5 years, but the newer ones, you can turn it off, but it's a button sequence. You have to hold a button for a certain amount of time, stick your tongue out the left side of your mouth and touch your nose while you're doing it, right? And it changes from year to year. It's really aggravating. But simple sense, yes, not all the way 4 low, sort of. Excellent, excellent question. So with traction control, if we let those tires spin, the traction control will do its job, right? And it will get power to the tires that have traction. Toyotas, it's going to be loud. Sounds like you're grinding gears. Jeep, kind of later on to the traction control game, but it is very quick and very efficient and not loud at all, right? You'll hear a little grumbling, a little grinding from the ABS pump, but it's not loud at all. It's funny because newer Jeeps with traction control, I hear people all the time say, I don't have traction control, my light's on. They don't realize that traction control is working in the background, and that's half the reason they can drive through the obstacles they do, and why you can take some of the not so great lines when you're choosing lines. But that traction control works so fast when you're outside the vehicle, when you're inside the vehicle, you don't see it. You don't even feel it. It just engages and goes. Where Toyota's is a lot louder and the way it kind of works. Now, if we are not keeping a consistent throttle with traction control, right, and letting those tires turn and spin and keeping the throttle set until we feel the vehicle start to lurch or want to move, then every time we come off that throttle engage again, that traction control is having to reset. So it never really has a chance to do it correctly. So again, that's why we want to keep that consistent throttle. Now, that being said, when you feel that vehicle start to lurch a little bit, you can gently roll onto that throttle to give it sufficient torque to get you up over the obstacle, okay, to give it sufficient torque to get it over, because that's not a lack of traction at that point in time, that's a lack of torque. Randy, be careful, Randy, talking about Jeeps are better, because I'm about to talk a little bit about some other stuff, and it may make you eat your own words, right? Now, the issue with traction control is it's always the same, right? So if you need traction control for sand and mud, those settings are a little bit different, right? Because we may want a little bit more tire spin in those to get us up and out, versus on rocks where we want it to really clamp down on that spinning tire and get that power to that other one. So traction control for a while was kind of a one size fits all. Toyota and Land Rover did this too, and some other manufacturers have done this. They have what they call Toyota's multi-terrain selector, MTS. Basically, it's a knob right next to your crawl control knob that you can turn that will adjust how aggressive your traction control is, right? Is it going to let some more tire spin happen, or is it going to be very aggressive in how it clamps down? Unfortunately, Jeep does not have a process for this, right? Jeep doesn't. That's one of the reasons why in their newer ones, they've made it so that you can turn the traction control off, okay? Now, some of their Grand Cherokees and stuff like that, that are out there, they do have some type of terrain select, but what that does, again, you know, if we choose rock crawl mode or rock mode or mogul mode, it's going to be pretty aggressive. If we choose sand or we choose mud, it's going to be less aggressive. Yep. Fords 2021 or newer have it too, that multi-terrain select, right? Broncos, okay? Broncos, that's a whole other can of worms, okay? When you are changing the different modes that they have, it actually will take it from 4 high to 4 low, or it could engage lockers for you, or it could do all kinds of stuff. So, you know, technology, right? Me personally, I don't like it doing that for me, but I do like the ability to change the aggressiveness on the traction control. But that's on the Bronco. Now, some of the pickups and stuff that have the multi-terrain select, they are just adjusting the aggressiveness of that traction control. Okay. Now, the downside to traction control is exactly like I said earlier. We have to let it spin. So those tires are sitting there digging and doing their thing. If they're in mud or whatever it may be, we could be tearing the trail up. But as long as you are in the trail where you are supposed to be, designated for 4-wheel drive, that's okay. But if we're off the trail, which you should never be, right, off trail, then that tire spin is very, very detrimental. Okay, and even on trail to a certain extent, it's detrimental. But traction control has come a long way, and it's very quick. Okay, it's very quick. And again, I love traction control. I don't have anything with traction control. Our Ram sort of has it a little bit, but it is, again, an incredible tool if used correctly. All right, so with traction control, right, takeaways: maintain, let that throttle, constant throttle, let those tires spin a little bit so that it can engage. Don't just immediately release when those tires start to spin, right? Now, I don't have a picture here, but let's talk about another traction device, okay? And this is something, regardless of your vehicle, that you can carry. Traction mats. These are not just for leveling out your tent so you can camp in it, right? Yes, Norman. You don't have crawl control because it's a manual transmission. Technically, you're always in crawl control, right? With a manual, you don't have the aggressiveness of it. You still have limited traction control, but it's nowhere near as aggressive. That's 100%. Yeah, Chris, never seen it slow them down, right? So, all right, traction boards. Okay, traction boards, all brands, right? I carry the treads, right? ARB treads, or the Ironman treads, either one of those. The Tread Pros is what I typically carry. They're a company out of Australia, just like MaxTrax is a company out of Australia. But traction boards are an incredible tool if you use them correctly. Now, I'm not going to get super in depth about the use, but I will tell you the most common mistake that I see, right? Most common mistake with traction boards that I see is that we put them on the spinning tires. Okay, we put one on the front axle and one on the rear axle. Typically, if you're using traction boards and you only have 2, they come in sets of 2. This is why I carry 4. We want to put them on the same axle. So either both of them go on the front tire or both of them go on the rear tire, right? And they provide traction through these. Used to work with a trainer, he called them nubbins, right? These knobs on here, and they will provide traction. Okay, but they're not a one-all beat-all, and they typically are a preventative measure, not a post measure after we've gotten stuck. I use them a lot. You can see my graveyard of traction boards that have been that have been kind of spun out and stuff like that, and they're worn down because they do melt. You don't want to spin tires on them. You'll even see right here it says do not spin wheels, right? Because they're plastic, and as we spin on them, they can melt. Now they do have metal traction boards and stuff like that. I typically don't go for those because if you spin tires on them, they're going to chew your tires up. Traction boards in my day was a 2x6, 100%. Yeah, 2x6s back in the day, and we put a little bit of grip on the top side of it. Man, that was a cheap traction board, and it worked, right? So floor mats can work also if you want to try to use that in the snow and things like that. But traction boards are a great tool. Not only can they help you raise your ground clearance a little bit, but they can also give you that additional traction, and they can level out your camper, your rooftop tent for you, right? We've even used them to level out our camper before at campgrounds. So traction boards are a great tool. This is our product of the week, specifically the Max Tracks. I don't have a coupon code for these. Sorry, guys. But I would encourage you to carry traction boards. They're a great tool. Typically, if you can use them correctly, they are faster, so much faster than winching, high lift jack, or even kinetic recoveries, right? So I love traction boards. Normally, you'll see me in my vehicles. I have 4 all the time. So, all right. So traction boards, great tool. Let me double check here while we're kind of going through this, make sure I did not miss any questions. Hopefully I didn't. But kitty litter, yes, kitty litter in the snow. My dad taught me that trick, throwing a little kitty litter under the tire or sand to get some traction. Don't stand behind a wheel with traction boards. Yes, they can come shooting out. And again, that kind of goes back to making sure, I'm going to throw this up here because this is important, from Dan Allison. This is important to how they're rigged, right? Most people will lay traction mats flat on the ground. Here I am going off on a tangent, right? Laying traction mats flat on the ground. You actually want to set them so that they're more of a ramp, so that they're ramped up. If we lay them flat, they're more likely to get kicked out. And we also engage less of these teeth. If we lay them flat, typically try to wedge them under the tires, we may only engage this first row of nubs or second row. But if we set them as a ramp, we actually engage the first 4 rows, 3 or 4 rows, and we get better traction. They're also more likely to get shoved into the ground than kicked out the back, right? That's a very good point, Dan. Very good point. So traction boards, man, they're such a great tool. 100% across the board. I love them, especially in the snow. If I see somebody slid off the side of the road, man, I grab traction boards, and a lot of times that's how I'll get them out. So one thing I am going to throw up here. All right, so got my ticker going there. While you guys have an opportunity here to throw some questions or comments out, I'm going to talk about an event real fast. So Southern 4-Wheel Drive's Trail Fest, April 11th to 14th, is at Colmont in Tennessee. Okay, Colmont's a newer park, one that Southern did help get open, and it's run by the town of Colmont there. And the QR code up there in the corner, scan that to go to their site to sign up. Southern 4-Wheel Drive is a nonprofit group that helps with opening up trails, right? Conservation, education, recreation is their mission statement. They do grant projects for trail cleanups, trail maintenance. They do education for teaching people about how to act on the trails, as well as I sit on their board as the education director. We also do trainings and stuff. And their Recreation Trail Fest is one of 2 events that they do. Being a nonprofit, this is how they raise their funds. So I really encourage you guys to go be a part of Trail Fest. Their raffles are amazing. Really great time. So scan that QR code or go to www.sfwda.org and you can sign up, right? And that will take you, you can go through their website to sign up for the event. I really encourage you to do that. Trail Fest is a blast, and being the first year at Colmont, it's really exciting. Trail Fest moves every 2 years. Okay, so last year, for the last 2 years, it was at Uwharrie. Before that, it was somewhere else, right? So it moves every 2 years. So, all right. Got some questions here, and I'm going to leave that QR code up and the dates right there. So we've got TNT Overlander. Please pick up your broken traction boards if they break after use. Yes. Yes, this is so important, especially if you're running some of the cheaper traction boards on the market, the Amazon traction boards. I'm not saying that they're bad, right? There's pros and cons to both. Expensive, probably going to hold up for a while, but they are a wearable item. They will wear out. Your cheaper traction boards will probably crack and break, but pick them up. So important. I've actually seen a chunk of traction board get shoved through the sidewall of a tire that was left on the trail. That individual was incredibly upset. So make sure you are cleaning up after yourself, even more so. And pet peeve here, do not throw sticks in ruts, because it's number one, sticks are like roller skates. They're not going to give you traction. They can give you ground clearance, but they're like roller skates. But it's also incredibly dangerous, because that stick can get wedged up and come through the firewalls of side by sides, or jam through four-wheelers, dirt bikes, but also on vehicles too. I've seen one jam through the firewall of an old Jeep. So, um, Cody Cheek, here we go. So, how can the air locker engage instant and electric custom mesh gears, as you mentioned? So, it's in the engagement mechanism, right? They both have to line up their splines in order to engage, but the air locker, typically the air lockers I've dealt with, the two major brands, Yukon and ARB, their splines are much bigger. So, it's easier for them to line up and engage, number one. Um, and the mechanism is much more simple than the electric ones. So that's one reason. The other side is just the amount of pressure that they have trying to engage them. The e-locker is doing it through an electronic mechanism. It's kind of on a timer, so it doesn't burn up the motor. So it doesn't have as much force behind it as the air lockers do. Typically, the air lockers have a lot more force behind it. Again, air pressure through a very small tube pushing it over. So that's why they do engage much faster. Most of the electric lockers that I've dealt with, the splines are much tinier and more fine splines. They have a much higher spline count, so they really have to get lined up to engage to work. And the collar typically is a little bit different. So hopefully that answers your question. But again, that's a little bit of manufacturer specific. But I've just never had an e-locker that engages and disengages as fast as an air locker. Yes, yes. Excellent question, Cody. Tony mentioned how to act on the trails is very important. So many bad actors out there, 100%. We are our own worst enemy as far as that goes. So really managing how to act on the trails. Jen, sticks are bad. Still have the piece you had to dig out of my sidewall. Yeah, they get shoved in sidewalls. They pierce tires. They do all kinds of stuff. So we really want to limit throwing sticks in there. If you do, for whatever reason, take them out when you're done. Go ahead and dig through that mud and get them out. So, all right, ladies and gentlemen, let me double check, make sure that I did not miss anything. I don't think I did. But thank you guys so much for joining us or joining me and listening to me drone on about this stuff. Make sure that you guys are liking this, sharing this, telling your mom, dad, aunts, uncles, dog's hairdresser, dentist, whoever you can, right? Tell them about this. Even if they're not interested in off-road, tell them about this, right? These are tools that can help people. Some of these things are tools that can help people anytime. But the biggest thing is share this. Share it on your personal Facebook page. Go give us a like on YouTube. Every little bit helps us to reach more and more people. It helps us build our brand, which is super important. At the end of the day, we are a small business. We are two owners, employees, right? Sarah and myself. If you don't count our kids, they work for free. I don't pay them anything except some food, and I let them sleep every once in a while. I just throw some scraps under the door. Not really. But so we're a small business, and marketing is our biggest thing. So thank you guys, and make sure you're doing that. And most importantly, guys, get out and find some adventure. Super important. Always feel free to kind of ask us, and we're glad to help you out any way we can. Yeah, Tony, glad to do it. Glad to do it. But thank you guys so much again for listening to me, and get out, find some adventure, and be safe.